Hello and welcome to game 50 of TCEC's Premier Division. This is the game with reverse colors played between Leela and Komodo MCTS. And in this one, Leela is with black. But just before we jump into the game, let's see the current standings. We see that Stockfish is leading the pack with 1 point ahead of Leela, and the others on 7.5 and so on. It looks like it's going to be again a final between Stockfish and Leela, but this competition is still going on for some days, so we'll have to wait and see what happens in the end. So the game started with c4, c6. You have the same moves, of course, as in the previous game. And if you would like to know more about these opening moves, then check the previous video. And here now, after queen c2, e6, b3 and bishop d6, of course, we reached the end of the book. And we followed the first game for a couple of moves. And here now, after bishop b2, in this game, Leela played queen e7. As I mentioned, bishop g6 is the main move, and also queen b8 has been played to not allow this knight to e5. And in the first game, Komodo MCTS played queen c7 and in the end lost, of course not because of the opening, but Leela preferred to develop the queen to e7. And now knight e5 is possible, and Komodo jumped right in. And of course, taking out this knight is not possible, because if you take it with the knight, then you run into this fork. And if you take with the bishop, then after pawn takes, this knight has to go. And it doesn't have good squares. If it goes to e4, then white just wins a pawn and white is winning. So taking out the knight is not possible. Leela played here bishop back to g6, and now we have rook e1. Taking this bishop is of course possible, but Komodo is not hurried to take out this bishop, because then this pawn would recapture and would allow this rook to attack down the h-file. Leela didn't castle yet, so this rook could steer some trouble. So it's better to just wait with this capture and wait until black castles. The game now continued with rook e1, but at this point Leela decided to take the light squared bishop himself. And here Komodo is already threatening to get in e4 and threaten e5, forking these two pieces. For example, if Leela would castle, then after e4 she would be pretty much forced to take this pawn. And after rook recaptures, we can see that now the rooks are active. They have a semi-open file to work with. And also d5 could come at some point to uncover this bishop, which could become a very, very strong piece. So instead of castles, Leela preferred to block the e-file with knight e4. And if now Komodo would try to win a pawn with knight takes on e4, then after pawn takes and knight f4 or knight e5, doesn't really matter, Leela has f5 defending the e4 pawn, and this would be just an equal game. White can get in his break with e4. Another option, instead of taking the knight on e4, would be to play f3. But here now Leela would have knight takes, exchanging the knights, and after queen takes and castles, white can get in e4, and e5 has to be stopped again. But now after d takes and pawn takes, Leela has e5. And the best for white here is to exchange the pawns. If Komodo would play d5 here, then he would be removing the pressure on this pawn, which now is adequately defended, and this would allow black to play f5 and activate the rooks. So it's best to take here, but then after everything gets exchanged on e5, white would have an isolated pawn on e4 for no compensation basically, and black would be better. So that's why after knight e4, instead of f3 and knight takes, after playing a4 and Leela castled, Komodo MCTS played knight f1, avoiding the knight exchange, and now f3 will push the knight back to f6. We have rook e8, f3, knight back, and now after the centralization of the rooks, we have queen c1. e4 at this point is already a strong move, but we have first queen c1, and after h6, king h1 and knight h5, with the idea to bring the queen out to h4 and get an attack going together with this bishop, we have finally cd, cd and e4. And again e5 has to be stopped, so we have d takes, pawn takes, and now e5. If white takes here on e5, then we get again into a position where white would have an isolated pawn on e4 and black would be better. So to avoid that, KomodoMCTS played d5. Leela continued with rook c8 to attack the queen, and now after queen e3 she played knight f4. And taking out this knight on f4 is not so great, because then after knight takes and pawn takes, the e5 square becomes available for one of black's pieces, and black could exchange his bishop, for example, for this one on b2, which would be a victory, a small victory for black, since the white bishop is attacking a pawn while black's bishop is defending one. Exchanging the dark square bishop in this case is desirable for black. So if knight takes, pawn takes, and queen, let's say, to h3, bishop e5, bishop takes, knight takes is a good position for black. So Komodo didn't go for this one. Instead, it played knight g3, and he's threatening to play knight f5 and attack these two pieces. So we have now queen g5. Knight f5 now fails because of queen g2 mating the king. So instead of knight f5 we have queen f3 defending this pawn. Now knight f5 again is possible, but Leela stops that with g6. And now since rook c2 and taking on g2 is a threat, Komodo defended with knight back to f1, and after rook c2 with rook d2. We have now the other rook defending this one on c2. Leela would really like to keep a rook on the 7th rank, but now came g3, forcing the knight to exchange itself, and after queen takes, this rook is now attacked twice, and Leela has a choice to either exchange the rook or drop back, and of course she chose the much better option, which is to drop back the rook to c7. Why is this the better option? Well, by dropping back the rook, Leela maintains control of the c-file. White is not in position to challenge these rooks. And this way Leela is constantly threatening to attack something by invading to one of these ranks. If instead Leela would take this rook, then the knight could recapture, and we can see that this knight can come now to c4 and block this file. And that would make this rook less useful. So it's much better just to keep the pressure on with these rooks and threaten to invade at some point. The game now continued with rook f2, still maybe making room for this knight. Bishop c5, attacking the rook. Knight goes to e3, and now h5. Leela is thinking about attacking the white king with h4. We now have rook e2 on pinning, but at this point now Leela takes out this knight before it could go to c4. Rook takes, and now after h4 and rook back to e2 we have h3. And Leela is all smiles here. She loves mating nets, and she just created one. And Komodo says it's equal, but Leela says it's minus 0.8. It's not winning, of course, but black has good prospects. The game continued with king g1, knight f6, queen f3, knight g4. This knight has a very nice position. Queen f1, attacking this pawn, queen h5, rook d1, knight back to f6. This knight, of course, cannot be taken because then this rook is hanging on e2 and black would threaten mate on g2. Rook e1, but now the king defends the knight. Queen f2, knight a7, queen f1, and now f6. Leela is defending the e5 pawn with another pawn, eliminating the need to defend the e5 pawn with a piece. And now this knight can defend f6. White will play rook f2 with pressure on this pawn, but the knight will be able to defend adequately. rook f2, queen g4, rook e2, rook c5, trying to get in b5, and if this pawn takes, then recapture the rook and attack b3. But now we have bishop a3, forcing the rook back, bishop b2, and now b5 still. And after a takes b and a takes b, we now have rook e1 and rook c2. The rook goes back to e2 though, and Leela drops back the rook to c5, rook e1 again, and now b4. And in this position, white doesn't have many useful moves if white reduces the pressure on the f6 pawn. Knight g5 could come with an attack on e4, so white has to be careful. Leela was expecting here queen e2 when she was preparing to drop back the queen and continue from here. But for some reason, little Komodo played here bishop c1, allowing the rook to the c3 square and allowing him to attack the b3 pawn. After rook c3, we have bishop d2, and now this pawn drops and white is better. Leela evaluates this at -2 already for black. Komodo agrees that it's better for black, -1.3. The game continued now with queen b5, trying to get some activity going on. But now after rook c7, checks are not really available, and taking this pawn also is not possible because of rook g3, and black wins after pawn takes and queen takes. This king has to defend the rook, so after king f8, h2, threatening the queen wins, and king e2 doesn't work because of rook c2 check, and this rook will drop and black wins. So taking this pawn, not possible. Komodo attacked the rook, but now we have queen back defending it. Rook a1, rook b7, queen a6, and now g5. King f1, rook c7, queen b6, queen c8, and now again bishop takes on b4 doesn't work because after rook c1 black would win. The king has to go to e2, but now after queen c2, king back, and rook check on b1, this bishop has to drop back to dodge the check, but then white loses the queen. So taking that pawn, still not working. We have king g1 instead. And now after rook b7 and queen d6, Leela played queen c4, activating her queen. This queen is now threatening to win the pawn on e4. It's also threatening to pin the rook. And the queen is suddenly very, very active. So KomodoMCTS decided to exchange the queens. And Leela accepts, because after pawn takes and rook c7, she has a completely winning position here. She evaluates this at -3.6. 3.6 pawns advantage. But where is that 3.6 advantage? Because it is true that black has an extra pawn on f6, but it also has a passive knight on h7. They both have passed pawns. Why is this a 3.6 advantage? Well, it becomes clear very, very soon. Now, since this pawn is attacked, Komodo needs to defend that, but now comes g4, a very, very strong move, threatening to get this knight to g5 and from there to f3. And if this knight gets to f3, then this is lights out for white. The knight would be super, super strong on f3, attacking everything in all directions and threatening all kind of forks. Quite simply, white can't afford to allow the knight to f3, so this bishop has to stay here to guard the g5 square. But this gives now Leela chances on the other side with her passed pawn. The game now continued with rook c4. Komodo is trying to get this pawn, but now came rook b1 check, which needs to be blocked by the f rook. Otherwise, rook takes, bishop takes, and white loses the c6 pawn. And after this, Leela exchanged one pair of rooks, and after king takes, she played b3. And now we can see the problem for white. This bishop has to guard g5, and it can't really go to this diagonal to stop the pawn. So here now after king e2 and b2, the rook was forced to go to b4 and leave the defense of the c6 pawn. And here now after they exchanged these pawns, we have a check, king g6, and now Komodo took the pawn. Leela is only one pawn up, but she has now rook c4 attacking this one, and white can't defend it. If the king goes to the e3 square, this allows knight g5, and white still loses that pawn, and with 2 extra pawns Leela would be winning. King e3, not good. Little Komodo played here king d3, but now after rook d4 the king was forced back to e2. Going to e2 is still better than e3 because that at least prevents this knight from coming to g5. It loses a pawn, but at least the knight is not active, at least for now. Now after king d3 check and king c2, since g5 is not available, the knight went to f8 and tries to find another route to f3. We have rook attacking the knight, but now the king defends from f5. The rook went back to the first rank to give some checks like this. But now came rook d8, allowing this knight to give this check and get to f3. So the bishop went to c3 to defend d4, but now the knight went to g5 and is still going to f3 to attack h2 and win it down, and black will win very soon. But at this point, since knight f3 is such a big threat, MCTS panicked and just sacked the bishop on e5. And of course now after f takes on e5, black is completely winning. Now after rook b7 and king e4, the king is going now to g2 and will win down this pawn on h2. White can do nothing, unfortunately. Here after king g2, this pawn doesn't even matter anymore. We have king c3, king takes on h2, rook b8, completely pointless move, rook takes on b8, king d2, and now after king g2 and king d1, the game was finally ended in Leela's favor. A very nice game in which Leela managed to take control of the c-file and constantly threaten to get into white's position and attack laterally. In the same time, Komodo managed to pile up on the f6 pawn, but this knight on h7 defended everything. And in the end, Leela managed to win the b3 pawn and then exchange the b4 pawn for the d5 pawn and win the e4 pawn, giving her 2 extra pawns that won the game. Please subscribe, like and share, and check out some of the other games. Thanks for watching and see you soon. Bye bye.